Okay, so good morning, our distinguished panelists and our curious and knowledge seeker participants. I'm Bashir Mubashir, a postdoc fellow at the American University. I also teach at the American University of Afghanistan. It's my pleasure to moderate this distinguished panel, and it's a great panel in a lot of ways. Most importantly, because we have an esteemed panel of scholars of Afghanistan who are not only experts of Afghan history, politics, and society, but also they have a unique lens to look at all these issues, and that's what I call the decolonializing lens. And that's what we are discussing today, our panelists particularly. And the topic of the panel, as you're familiar, is imagining and reimagining Afghanistan. And it's basically about the dominant narrative and the literature about Afghanistan that in a lot of ways has misrepresented the country and has been influenced by the colonial literature. And our panelists will discuss how and why that's the case. Without further ado, I will introduce our panelists. Just to follow the alphabetical order, I will introduce Dr. Anila Dawlatzai first. Dr. Anila Dawlatzai is a scholar of Afghan history and anthropology. She is a fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. And her last book, let me make sure I do not make a mistake about that,
book in progress.
Book in progress is War and What Remains, Everyday Life in Contemporary Kabul, Afghanistan. And then we have Dr. Benjamin Hopkins with us from the George Washington University. He's a Senior Associate Dean of Academic Affairs and Professor of History and International Relations. And his recent publication is The War That Destroyed America, Afghanistan's Coming Bell, which is published in Critical Asian Studies. Unfortunately, we do not have Dr. Michael Berry, who's a professor of history. He teaches at the American University of Afghanistan, and his last book, which is published in 2021, is Liqui Afghan. I hope I pronounced it right because it's written in French. And then we have Dr. Omar Sharifi, who is an assistant professor of social sciences and humanities, and he teaches at the American University of Afghanistan, a good friend of mine. And his recent publication is Hail Mary of Power Sharing in Afghanistan, which he co-authored with Michael O'Hanlon. I hope I pronounced his name right.
Yeah.
Okay, if I made any mistakes with regard to your recent publications or institutions, feel free to let me know, or let all our participants know. So all our panelists will have around 12 to 15 minutes to present, and then after that we will have a Q&A session. So we're going to start again with following the alphabetical order with Dr. Anila Dawlatzai. You're muted, Dr. Anila.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bashir. I wanted to thank the panelists for inviting me to this panel. I get invited, frankly, to quite a few panels on Afghanistan, and there's few that I actually accept these days. I've spent decades as a scholar of Afghanistan, and I have been waiting to participate in a panel that has had such thoughtful and critical intentions in thought, in spirit, for us to individually and collectively reimagine Afghanistan. And finally, to get to the task of ridding scholarship on Afghanistan and discourses on Afghanistan in general of the colonial narratives that have thus far shaped how Afghanistan has come to be understood and largely not understood at all. Now, by way of further explanation, when I say how Afghanistan has come to be understood, included in this is the clear assertion that how Afghans in Afghanistan have been represented by colonial narratives is intimately and ultimately linked to their ability to be killed, their killability. So when we represent Afghans as devout religious subjects only, they're not just devout religious subjects. They're devout Muslims, and Muslims, devout or even less devout ones, have frankly been deemed killable by US empire and by Europe in general. When we represent Afghans and their women as oppressed by their men only, they're not just oppressed women, they're subjects of savior by white men and white women alike, and the armies they summon to their project of saving. So as I've mentioned, I'm really heartened by the invitation and just by the thrust of this panel, and I hope that much more work can move forward and this can build momentum, because frankly, this is a long time coming. And those of us who have been working on Afghanistan for some time, that have grown up in Afghanistan and spent time there, know that this is a long time coming, right? And that it's Afghan-led is important. So what I want to do is in the little time, and I don't want to take too much time because I frankly want to give as much time as I can, even if that means giving some of my time allotted to me for discussion, right? So I'm going to keep my comments as short as possible, but what I thought was important, right? So given the panel that you all have convened, is to start with ourselves as those who write and perhaps teach on Afghanistan. What are the narratives we have peddled in our work which need to be upended, which need a proper dismantling? Okay, so what are the things that we have done in our own work? So I will share with you some of my work over the last 2 decades on Afghanistan. I'll just focus on one particular thing that I'm focusing on. When I started my PhD work in Afghanistan, my project was to work with widows. And my focus on working on widows in Kabul, and my research started in 2003, but my research in general in Afghanistan started in the 90s. My project on widows was literally to document what serial war has done to a people and a place, including the war that was ongoing in occupation by the United States and its allies, right? So I spent quite a lot of time, 5 years in Afghanistan, collecting research. As an anthropologist, you just spent a lot of time literally hanging out with Afghans. So you have the distinct opportunity and privilege to meet Afghans in their homes and just sit with them and understand what has happened with their families, to meet with them in different social, whether it's at home or outside, whether it's at a wedding or in shopping. You just have different ways that you can interact with them. So I've had the privilege to be able to do that for quite some time. And one thing that I thought that was important to do was to document what has happened to Afghans, and to document serially what has happened to Afghans, how they have suffered. And now, not only because of what's happening in Gaza, but in general, I've started to critique why I thought that was necessary. I mean, did I actually think as an anthropologist or as somebody interested in human rights, forget the academic part of it, did I actually think that if I showed that Afghans have suffered, people would change how they treated Afghans, that they would stop their suffering, right? So what task was I engaging in and hoping to engage in by doing the research that I did, right? So I'm gonna read a little bit that is coming from my book, but also work, because in my book, I'm critiquing my own work as well as the work that has thus far been produced on Afghanistan. So it's not only work that was done decades ago, but work that has been done in the last 10 years, right? So my grievance at the expectation and demand to narrate decades of Afghan loss has complicated my task as an anthropologist. When I am summoned to evidence Afghan pain and Afghan injury, for whose recognition do I catalog this loss and to what end? Those who demand evidence of loss expose their own decades of refusal to attend to Afghanistan as a place that has and is being brutalized. Consequently, Afghanistan becomes an oversight, a failure sedimented over decades as a refusal to see. The demand for evidence of injury is not only a marker of such refusal and reminiscent of the violence itself, but reveals its own specific fascination and the liberal enjoyment in the pain of others. While committing myself to reside in the realm of refusal to catalog loss, I also endeavor for others to grasp how loss is registered as loss within a generalized landscape of war. So what my work in general is trying not to do is chronicle the material and other losses that have transpired in Afghanistan, to their quantifications and to count them. Thick or even thin descriptions. Remember, that is what anthropology and sort of is the hallmark of anthropology, right? It's thick descriptions of the serial deaths, sufferings, hardships, and forms of degradation over the past 45 years of serial war. Those tasks are important, albeit exhausting, but more critically, such a recounting risks being folded into the ambivalent work of acknowledgement, a desire to have recognized what one has suffered and lost. The need to narrate the losses somehow feels like a betrayal. Did one really have to go to Afghanistan, as I did, and sit with Afghans or be, quote, Afghan, to know what that Afghans were being pummeled, that they were suffering? To be sure, forms of enumeration and chronicling are often necessary. So elsewhere, I've done some of that work, observing how whiteness is reproduced in witnessing and narrating damage in Afghanistan, and more broadly, the war on terror. I share Indigenous studies scholar Eve Tuck's concerns about damage studies becoming an investment in brokenness and depletion. What is lost when I have and do represent Afghans as broken, depleted, damaged, right? So how do we as scholars of Afghanistan document what has happened to Afghans and be attendant to what representing them as damaged and depleted does to the already extremely problematic narratives out there of Afghanistan? So for me, my initial thrust into documenting the damage was to show what serial war and imperial wars does to a people in a place. But am I producing forms of damage and harm in the ways I represent Afghans when I do that, right? And it's something I'm asking all of us as scholars and friends of Afghanistan to think about, right? I just want, and I know Michael Berry isn't here, right? But for some of this, and as I read the Reimagining Afghanistan, right? For some of us, this is a future-oriented project, right? We look to the future of how we're going to craft Afghanistan studies. How can we decolonize it, as you have said, Dr. Bashir, right? But for others, like Michael Berry, it's a past-oriented project, right? Michael Berry was already part of reimagining Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? It's very, I mean, he spent time with Ronald Reagan in the White House doing whatever he was doing. And I want to know, I mean, we all know what that led to, right? But I want to reflect on and have him reflect on the project that he was a part of, right? So we're saying that it's a future-oriented project, but for some of us as scholars, and I've tried to look at my work over the past 20 years, it's also a past-oriented one, right? To reflect on our own work and our own roles. I didn't have tea with anyone in the White House, but I did my work as a scholar of Afghanistan in the humble ways that I could. And I am reflecting and trying to look at the own narratives that I have peddled. I think that I, from the beginning, have been trained as a post-colonial scholar, so have been quite critical of colonial narratives and colonial lenses, and yet still I'm critiquing my work, and I encourage others to do the same. I will give over my time now only so we can have more time for conversation, and I hope what I offered is at least something where we can start from. I have much more to say, and I hope that will come out in Q&A or something. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Dr. Benjamin Hopkins.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mubashir. First of all, yourself and other organizers of the panel for organizing this. It's a real honor to be on this panel with so many esteemed scholars. And it's also very humbling to follow Dr. Dalitzai, who is always just very articulate about many of the problems that we face, as well as contribute to as scholars. As with Dr. Dalitzai, I will keep my comments rather truncated because I think the interesting thing will come out in conversation and Q&A. But I would just, kind of wear my hat as a historian and say that some of my comments are really temporally focused. And what I mean by that is I'll actually start with the title of our panel today, which is Imagining and Reimagining Afghanistan. And I think it surprises none of us, and it's just a sad fact that we probably all recognize that really we're in a moment of, as it were, de-imagining, or I would say forgetting Afghanistan. I don't know how many of you saw yesterday, but the Afghanistan War Commission came out with its first report, and just quickly skimming over it, no surprise, the one thing that was absolutely missing were the Afghans and Afghanistan. It was a completely navel-gazing undertaking, which I suspect the final report will resemble, as have other American government reports. And so we're really in a moment of erasure, as it were, of Afghanistan. And I do think one of our responsibilities as scholars is to keep the flame, as it were, of Afghans and Afghanistan in the scholarly, as well as to the best extent we can, public imagination. I also find it kind of interesting when we talk about reimagining or imagining Afghanistan, right away, as a historian, to me, we're putting down a temporal marker in the sense of Afghanistan as a political and social phenomenon is a time-bound one, right? It has a history, it comes out of a place, and it will eventually be subject to history. And I always find that really interesting because one of the most salient features in the Occidental imagination about Afghanistan is its timelessness, a refusal to acknowledge that it is a object of history, that it is a time-bound phenomenon, that there was a pre-Afghanistan identity, for instance, inhabiting this space culturally, politically, socially. And inevitably, there will be a post-Afghanistan identity inhabiting this space. And I think that's actually one of the questions that I'll return to in my comments closer to the end. Thinking as a historian, I would just kind of run through a genealogy, in particular, reflecting my own specialty as a historian of the colonial period. Which I think this is now fairly well established and been well established and well absorbed into the scholarship over the past 20 years. It's been a real privilege to be a scholar of Afghanistan during this period because there has, I think, been a flowering of studies of this space, even if they've not been taken up, as it were, in mainstream discussions of Afghanistan. And it's extremely humbling now to also see the flourishing of young scholars as they're coming out. It's just sad that it's at a moment when the trajectory of Afghanistan looks rather bleak. So to think about how Afghanistan has been imagined historically, again, I would lay down the temporal marker of when does Afghanistan become first imagined? And that this is really a phenomenon of the 19th century. I don't think that's particularly controversial thing to say, but it does raise this question, which is not unique to Afghanistan. It's really true of any political and social identity. And that is, what happens to the previous identities and polities that had inhabited this space? And there's a multiplicity, I think the most salient of which is the idea of Khorasan. You know, much of this space historically has in Persianate literature been referred to and known as Khorasan. And I think one of the yet to be fully excavated elements of the history of Afghanistan is really coming to grips with what happens to these pre-existent identities as we have the construction of Afghanistan as a state and Afghan national identity through the course of the 19th and 20th century. Are they absorbed into a broader Afghan identity? Are they displaced by it? You know, what is the relationship there? And I think that's, if I were to kind of flag an area that is ripe in my mind for inquiry, it would be that. But kind of moving forward in time, you know, I think it's well established by this point that much of our vision and understanding of modern Afghanistan has its origins, in particular, with the British colonial encounter with the Afghan lands through the course of the 19th century, beginning, of course, with the mission of a man named Mount Stuart Elphinston at the beginning of the 19th century. I've written about him in my own work and about how he conceptualizes Afghanistan, and his conceptualization of Afghanistan and the Afghans really become the foundation of British colonial policy towards the Afghan lands. And that shaping of the colonial conception of Afghanistan really kind of sets the frame, as it were, or sets the board within which modern Afghan political identity develops, especially in the eyes of Occidental powers over the course of the new 2 centuries. You know, what's particularly interesting to my mind is the continued salience of Elphinston's vision. When I teach my courses on Afghanistan, I always tell my students that I think the most important book they should read is Elphinston's account of the Kingdom of Kabul, which was published in 1815, because of both its ambition in outlining a vision of Afghan society, but also its continued power over that imagination of Afghan society. That's not to say it looks exactly the same today, but it is to say it really is kind of the foundation and bedrock upon which later visions of Afghanistan, at least in the Anglo-American mind, I would say, is built. And I remember years ago during the kind of hotter phase of the War on Terror, comparing in one of my classes Elphinston's account, which is, as I say, is published in 1815, with some of the work product of the human terrain system, which used to be available on the web but is no longer available, and just kind of the resonances and rhetoric which continues 2 centuries later to really populate, as it were, the official mind, which goes again to that point I was making earlier about Afghanistan really being thought of as atemporal or timeless by the Occidental imaginary, that this is a place beyond time or without time, a pre-modern place at best. I'd also say that one of the things we need to consider when imagining Afghanistan or reimagining Afghanistan is also to, as it were, demystify Afghanistan as somehow exceptional, in the sense of, if we look at a global picture, Afghanistan is one of these kind of global peripheral areas that has really been left out of the construction of the modern state and political and economic system, which I would argue is in part a byproduct of colonialism, European and European colonialism, but also the advent of a global capitalist system. That many of these spaces, Afghanistan, or we could talk about Somalia, northern Nigeria, some other places similarly situated, had previously been really integral to regional political and economic systems, and through the advent of global capitalism in the 19th and 20th century, become these kind of odd peripheries that are by and large excluded from that system, which then have a detrimental effect on state formation and on the ways that those state operates. So I think it's important to kind of, as it were, de-exceptionalize the Afghan story and recognize that it is replicated elsewhere in the world. I mentioned really quickly the British kind of role in defining the Afghans as a colonial power and the Afghan polity as a colonial power. We also need to recognize that the Russian Empire historically plays a significant role. It would be remiss of me to not give a shout out to Tim Noonan's work on that humanitarian invasion, about the Soviet invasion, but Tim's work really does thoughtfully look at the ways in which Afghanistan and Afghans are constructed and considered and then acted upon by first Tsarist bureaucracy and then Soviet bureaucracy, much to Afghans' detriment. Of course, I'm replicating power dynamics by privileging that European focus, and we need to remember that there are also other influences and ways of thinking about Afghanistan, which emanate from its near neighbors. I'm not the best person to comment on those, and so my comments will be brief and fleeting. But the imaginary of Afghans and Afghanistan emanating from South Asia, there's a long entwined history where Afghans and Afghan polities play a centrally definitional role in the political and cultural history of South Asia, especially along the North Indian Plain. There's Afghan colonies and Afghan polities that long populate different spheres within the northern half of the Indian subcontinent, and that are really central to the political development of India over time. Niall Green has done some wonderful work, for instance, on Afghan saintly lineages and how those are kind of integrated and thought about in terms of political genealogy in early modern South Asia. At the same time, while Afghans and Afghanistan has played a centrally important role in the political history of South Asia, there's also been a strain of caricature of Afghans as the rough and wild tribesmen. That caricature in part is replicated and amplified by colonial caricatures of Afghans. I think many of us will be familiar with perhaps the most famous colonial caricature, which is the character of Mahbub Ali in Kipling's work, Kim. On the other side, we do need to think about the role that historically Iran and Persia has played in thinking about and defining Afghanistan and imagining Afghanistan, especially as Afghanistan has provided a strong counterpoint in the evolution of contemporary Iranian political identity. Afghanistan becomes the foil, as it were, against Persian refinement, civilization, kingly traditions, and modernity. Afghans represent the wild kind of alternative to the refinement you find in the Persian lands, and I think that is something that, for instance, Farouche Kashani-Sabet in her book Frontier Fictions gestures towards, but there's further work that can be done there. And then lastly, in terms of the way that Afghanistan has been imagined, I think it's really important and also underexplored to think about how the Muslim community globally, or sections of the Muslim community, the Muslim Ummah, have thought about Afghanistan really over the past 2 centuries, because Afghanistan represents, to one form of thinking, a kind of space of refuge for those fleeing from oppression elsewhere. Afghanistan as an unconquered and uncolonized land remains a kind of heartland of a mythical Dar al-Islam, or a mythical kind of Muslim Zion. And we definitely see a history of outsiders seeking refuge in Afghanistan, and actually using Afghanistan as a base for activities that often express themselves violently elsewhere in the world. Beginning with Syed Ahmed of Raebareli at the beginning of the 19th century, who's a conservative Bengali revivalist. He flees to the frontier, the freedom and air of the hills, as it were, and kind of spawns a long-term colony of religious refugees who live along that frontier for most of the 19th century. The British themselves are concerned about quote unquote Indian Wahhabis who flee to the Afghan kingdom, sometimes given refuge by Afghan rulers, sometimes rejected by Afghan rulers. We even see more popular movements like the Hijrat movement during the Caliphate movement in the 1919-1920 period, where we see Indian Muslims flee to Afghanistan, saying, British India is a polluted space and Afghanistan is part of the Dar al-Islam. So it's a space of refuge. We could even see that kind of genealogy of thought, for instance, perhaps with some of the Arab Afghans who go to Afghanistan in the 1980s to fight with the Mujahideen, and people like Osama bin Laden. It's not an accident or simply an outcome of circumstance that bin Laden finds refuge or believes that this is a space of refuge for him. Additionally, as an unconquered space, there is a buried history of Afghanistan in the anti-colonial imaginary. I know there's a little bit of scholarship more to be done on the way, for instance, Japan in the interwar period looks at Afghanistan as a place of resistance against European colonialism, which is a very interesting and alternative history that has yet to be explored. So there's a lot of opportunity there. So I guess what I'd say just in conclusion is that, as I said at the outset, this has been a really rich time to be a scholar of Afghanistan and Afghan history. And I'm very encouraged to see much of that scholarship continue, especially with the younger generation of Afghans themselves, who are either recently finished with their projects or are coming up with their projects. And I think that it's really incumbent on us in this moment of forgetting, because that is the moment that we're living in, this forgetting of Afghanistan, to try and really be a stalwart, to be a reminder, not only to our academic colleagues, but to the extent that we can, those in power, as well as to the population at large, who would rather just move on and forget about this entire episode. I look forward to questions, and again, I just thank Dr. Malasher and others for organizing this panel, and we'll send it back to you.
Well, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking opening. So, Dr. Omar Sharifi.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here. And it's actually a great pleasure to see you, Dr. Hopkins, Anil John, especially Mubashir Sahib, after a long time, since the last time we met in Kabul was in our campus at the AUF, which is now, I think, is a training ground for Al-Qaeda and Khanis and others. So, but I mean, my work actually, when I looked at the title of this talk about reimagining Afghanistan, it kind of reminded me of this moments after 2001, especially when we suddenly kind of faced with a very new phenomenon, a phenomenon that's called the international community. We've never, I remember when we went through this, when a communist government fell, when the Mujahideen came, and there was like an era, it was kind of an end of an era for a lot of Afghans, in a sense that suddenly we are faced with a completely new version of what it means to be an Afghan Muslim, because we always thought that being Muslim and being Afghan is kind of synonymous with each other, it's kind of complements each other. But after the Mujahideen, I suddenly noticed, I remember in Kabul, and they looked at all of us as, especially people in Kabul, that they kind of looked at us as not how they imagined to be a proper Muslim. Though there was a lot of war, there was nothing happening. But with the coming of the first Taliban, I remember for the first time, when I walked in this Kabul film and I walked in Sharanau, I was looking at all these people who look like they talk in Pashto, or some of them in Farsi, but most of them in Pashto, but they were talking about religion and about that, something that was completely alien to me. And actually, and then Kabul, I remember growing up in Kabul and seeing that Kabul was filled with a lot of internationals like Arabs, Filipinos, a lot of Punjabis, a lot of like Central Asians, especially in the late 90s. And then 2001 happens, and here we have a new version of international community, the Western international community, who came and who tried to kind of again, bringing us a new way of what Afghanistan is supposed to be. In all this time, I think a lot of my generation, we started to think who we are actually, in a sense, because we thought of ourselves one thing before the coming of the Mujahideen, something that was kind of, there is a continuity with history, there is something that nothing interrupted. But in the last 10 years, the 90s, there was, I felt, and a lot of like other people who were like we growing up in the same neighborhood in Kabul, and that there is a disconnect with everything that thought that's supposed to define us as a people, supposed to define us as individuals, supposed to define our religion, and even supposed to define what we called in that time our culture. So with the coming of international community and stuff, suddenly a space opened, and the understanding among all of us was these are coming from the West, and they probably read quite a lot about Afghanistan. They probably know very much, because none of us actually spoke English. We hardly spoke English. We did not know what these people do. They looked very strangers to us, but also they kind of have a promise of doing good. But the time, and that kind of slowly shaped my mind, and especially kind of made me think about my whole now upcoming book, that when I realized that there is an absolute, or to a large degree, a misunderstanding between what we thought ourselves, and what the foreigners, or Kharijis as we used to call them, looked at us and tried to define us. And it was not something like malicious, I think. It was not something bad or good in our minds, because we absolutely have no idea of who they were. So it was an absolutely mutual. There was very little, and they were, and in between us, there was a new category that emerged in Afghanistan called the Afghan diaspora, what we call them, the passport, the two passportees, who became kind of a bridge between the natives like us and the internationals who like trying to help or rule or define us. So in this kind of world, I realized that. And then new terminology is introduced to us. For instance, the new terminology of the warlord, that suddenly a category of people considered good and category of people considered bad. And so you have the warlords, which never existed, neither in Persian or Pashto before 1980s or something. But with them, so we suddenly, and we thought that there is a deep understanding and knowledge based on a fundamental global and principles of human rights, that actually these categories stems from those meanings. But the more I looked at, and I realized that because of the lack of, we don't understand the foreigners and they don't understand us, and there was also a kind of we were not kind of clicking very well with the intermediaries, the diaspora, who technically were the largest and the most powerful group in terms of executive, in terms of financial power in Afghanistan. Because if you looked at, for instance, the executive branch in Afghanistan, like people who rule, 63% of them, above 70% of them by 2006 were dual citizens, and by 2021, I think 98% of the people who were running the government were dual citizens. So there was like this category. So this kind of came to us like who we are in this age. We're thinking about human rights. We're thinking about democracy. We're thinking about like building a new country. And there was like massive changes happening around us. Like suddenly, for the first time, millions of people returned voluntarily. And there was a massive also movement of people from rural areas to their cities. Suddenly, for the first time, then the cities, the peripheral cities of Afghanistan, who for 100 years did not exist as something of a major urban centers like Mazar, Jalabad, Herat, Kandahar, suddenly they become very big cities, and they kind of develop their own economy, their own intelligentsia and everything. So in this case, I tried to understand, and that kind of, as an anthropologist, and I was a student of anthropology, I tried to kind of capture this moment of what, for the lot of us, in this particular moment of absolute transition, at the same time bombing, at the same time suicide attacks, at the same time promises and at the same time betrayals, and then corruption and hope and media and songs and cries, all this. In this case, how the kind of like I don't want to use the normal people, but the average Afghans who live in the Kabul or in Mazar or in Kandahar, how they kind of what they think of all this. This new kind of a new world in which for the first time we were absolutely connected with each other and with the world in a way that I think was unprecedented through technology, through roads, through infrastructure, and through media. So that's kind of led and I ask this question because when I listened to, especially both the internationals, to this new category of the world, and also specifically to the ruling diaspora who are ruling Afghanistan in a sense, the image of Afghanistan that was presented as like a highly fragmented, very tribal, and as Dr. Hopkins mentioned, kind of like this wild tribal group of people, and to kind of have little cohesion and stuff. But at the same time, I was asking that how, if we are that kind of fragmented, a mosaic of ethnic groups constantly in conflict with each other, how that's possible that from Bangladesh to Bosnia, Afghanistan is literally the only Muslim country that never experienced a secessionist movement. In a sense, while every single ethnic group in Afghanistan have a co-ethnic on the other side of the border, actually not a co-ethnic, but also countries. And at the same time, what kind of, and then how this, why at the height of the civil wars, all these competing groups, whether it's Taliban or United Front, Northern Alliance and others, why they always had the claim about the kind of entirety of the territory. They never actually says we're going to fight for these things. And how somehow we managed to pass this stage, and especially when our previous sort of ideas about ourselves after Mujahideen was destroyed, or if not destroyed, was kind of like lost. How we think about ourselves in this new age of connection, connectivity, chaos, but also lots of hope and lots of like movements between different peoples. And that kind of guides my work in anthropology. So I did I decided to actually, in my work, I tried to see, so I have to, as an anthropologist, I have to find a site to study. This, what I kind of in my work call the kind of the sense of national attachment without nationalism in a sense. Where I can look at. So I started to look at the national days, our holiday, national days of Independence Day, blah. And I realized that within 100 years, it constantly was changing. There was actually no national day that survived a particular regime. And so there was no official kind of a holiday that celebrates the Afghanness or Afghan nation in a sense that actually survived the regime and stuff. So I started to then turn my eyes and my gaze in a sense and look at something that actually has nothing to do with the regime, with the government, but actually the government was also completely involved with it. But it's cultural, it's religious, but also at the same time, it's historical. So in my work, I started to, and at the same time, it's happening continuously, at least documented for 150 years, if we can find it. Always is. And I was looking at the Nowruz event, in which hundreds of thousands of people get together, and they're from different, and it's happening in Mazar Sharif, but also happening in a lot of places, but it's officially inaugurated at Mazar Sharif, in which it's actually inaugurated in a shrine that's dedicated to a for the first imam of the Shias, but majority of the people who come there are actually Sunni Afghans. And at the same time, it's technically what some people call it like a Persianate or a tradition, but majority of the people in the course of history, but also even now, who celebrated, patronized it and stuff, were actually Turkic or Pashtun or and kind of dynasties and who actually put it together. And at the same time, it is a pre-Islamic tradition, but fundamentally it's taking shape within an Islamic shrine. And more importantly, the people who actually organize it are mostly the guilds, the businesses, the merchants, the locals. But at the same time, the government have a very little to, but the government has to inaugurate it because it symbolizes the authority of that they are in power, the raising of the flag, the Jandi of Nowruz. So I could kind of tonight together, I thought like, oh, maybe I should look at this to understand what the sense of collectivity, that collective kind of conscience that we have as a people kind of emerges and perpetuates itself. And that in a way, I spent a long time, probably as Kharam Dawladzai said, like you as an anthropologist, you have to like quite a long time, both as an Afghan there, but also as a new scholar, and as a scholar, you have to spend a long time to study that. So I try to kind of document all of that experience and trying to find a way to explain this an Afghanistan which kind of is not so mystic. It's just how the normal people, how the people imagine themselves, what they experience in terms of when they say democracy, for instance, or Dawlat-e Demokratik, as we call it in Afghanistan, how democracy means for them, how in a local level and in a provincial level that kind of perpetuated itself, and that actually how the people find themselves in these moments. And I found, and then specifically this, because I think because religion permeates almost, as Tom Barfield once says, every aspect of our lives in Afghanistan. And then this version of religion, this version of Islam in Afghanistan that is historical, that is based on some sense of continuity, in a way come to a discussion and sometimes confrontation with a new kind of a Talibani, Deobandi, Wahhabi, whatever we call it, kind of an Islam that comes from Taliban or Mujahideen or South Asian version of Islam. So that is kind of my work, and the idea of behind my work is to actually present an image of Afghanistan by an indigenous scholar. Perhaps for the first time, maybe in half a century or maybe quarter of a century or something, to say what the normal Afghans actually imagine. They are not ahistorical people. They are not something stuck in time. And to kind of show these connections and disconnections, but at the same time, how they imagine themselves within the world, a world that sees them that as static and not moving, but how actually a lot of amazing and interesting things happening inside Afghanistan that in a way make Afghans probably a very, very kind of a global citizen rather than just being a static tribal people. So this is my work. And I had a lot of now a little bit of trouble. I don't normally, after Ashraf Ghani, I have a hard time calling myself an anthropologist out of shame or whatever. But it's a work of anthropology. It's a work of anthropology, and I'm trying to, as like an indigenous anthropologist, try to capture this without sort of like to understand what it means to have a sense of nationness or collective without the sense of nationalism that is defined by Western theoretical models. I primarily not primarily, but kind of I tried in my work to balance local native kind of resources with the kind of what's kind of available in Western academia, probably Anglo-American kind of academic discourses on Afghanistan. So this is my own work, and I'm looking forward to actually hear for questions. I think I'm within the time frame that is allocated, so please. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. Thank you very much. I think Dr. Michael Berry is trying to join, and there's some issue there, so I hope it's resolved. But we can go ahead and start Q&A until he arrives, and then he will have his time to have his opening remarks. Okay, so one of the questions I have is the geopolitical location of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is located in a very unique region in Asia. On the east, it has borders with China, which is an East Asian country, right? And in the north, it has border with the Central Asian countries. In the south, it has borders with South Asian countries. And in the west, with Iran, which is a Middle East country. So Afghanistan is basically an intersection of the Far East and the Middle East and the Central Asian countries and South Asian countries. But despite all that, if you look at the literature, for example, about South Asia or Central Asia or Far East Asia or Middle East, Afghanistan is almost missing, except for the past few years, but it's almost missing. And my question is, why is that the case? Why it's not the other way around? Why we don't have a lot of literature? Why not all of these regions don't include Afghanistan as part of their case studies? Anyone can jump in and answer. Dr. Anila?
I guess I'll give my preliminary answer and critical take on academia in general. So just in the past 2 years, I'll take the institution where I am at currently, University of California at Berkeley. Afghanistan was part of South Asia Studies. And that was largely during the War on Terror until 2021. And after Afghanistan left sort of the collective imagination when the Ukraine war started, Afghanistan studies was put into Central Asian studies. So this really corner sort of, yeah. So I'm giving you that as an example to say the way Afghanistan and the way you've laid it out, Dr. Bashir, shows the many intersections and how exciting and fascinating and wonderful it could be if only, right? But academia has been seriously implicated in the ways that it itself has used Afghanistan as a discipline when it's necessary, whether for funding or otherwise. That has played a large role, not only with funding, but with power and governance, right? And how closely it works with policy and policy institutes, with where Afghanistan scholarship lies. And I think that has fundamentally sort of cut off the legs in many ways, right? Because you're navigating between Middle East studies, South Asian studies, and Afghanistan in many ways that has been used, you know, and I would like to say it mirrors how Afghanistan has been treated and how Afghans have been treated as subjects of colonial discourses, but then that means that I'm excluding academia from that project, and I don't want to do that because academia has been part and parcel of that project, right? So I'm just reiterating what we already know, but saying that that's unfortunately how the interconnectedness of scholarship and academia with a colonial project.
Please, Dr. Benjamin.
Yeah, if I can follow Dr. Dalatsai, I mean, just a couple of things. You're right, Afghanistan is the kind of bastard child that falls between two stools always. Just a pointer for anybody seeking an academic job, never say you're an Afghan scholar. I mean, as Dr. Dalatsai really eloquently put it, the politics of academia, right? You need to be a scholar of something else, and then Afghanistan happens to be your side gig, because the only real, location of Afghan studies, especially pre-2001, was the very oddly constituted department in Nebraska, which was largely its own history with CIA funding, right? But I think actually kind of at least thinking about it historically, yeah, I mean, if you go back to the rise of geopolitics under Halford Mackinder at the beginning of the 19th century, and Mackinder's, pretty simple thesis, whoever controls the world island controls the world. And what's the world island? Well, it's Eurasia. And what's the heart of the world island? Afghanistan. So on the one hand, Afghanistan really is the center of the world. I think all of us here on the panel probably believe that, not only intellectually, but emotionally. But the other thing, kind of riffing, as it were, off Dr. Dalatsai's comment about power, is the fact that Afghanistan was never conquered, right? For various complicated reasons. It was never integrated into an imperial space. And as a consequence, understandings of it shaped in the colonial imagination have been always done at arm's length, always done, as it were, remotely. And it's as a consequence as well become peripheralized when we move from the colonial into the post-colonial world. Because let's remember, when we move towards decolonization in the latter half of the 20th century, this is not a radical reordering of global power, right? This is just a transitioning from colonial elites to what many would look as post-colonial elites, right? But the form of state power, the distribution of economic power and such, remains fundamentally unchanged. And so if Afghanistan is frozen out of the colonial and imperial world of the 19th century, it's not a huge surprise that Afghanistan is frozen out of the post-colonial present that we inhabit today. The one thing I would say to end, though, however, is, we talk a lot about the underinvestment in Afghanistan studies, the ignorance and such. And yet, the relationship intellectually, but also materially, with Afghanistan of major world powers has been incredible. I mean, for instance, the war in Afghanistan by the United States, inflation adjusted, is the most expensive war in American history. And the United States, during the Cold War, Afghanistan per capita was the largest recipient of Cold War aid. And so there's this kind of contradiction between a kind of, we don't know anything about this place, let's not think about this place, but the material investment in this place, at least in dollar amounts, is kind of mind-boggling and enormous.
I mean, to kind of add something, so mostly so we have it in a kind of a Western tradition, which Afghanistan is kind of lost between Central Asia, Middle East, and stuff. But actually, if you look at the Russian or the Chinese don't know much about the Russians or the Soviet Union stuff. There is actually an independent department of Afghanistan studies, and there are several institutes through which they still, I think, in Moscow and others, they look at Afghanistan almost as itself, but also in relationship quite a lot with Central Asia, though it kind of constitutes. For instance, the Khushal Khan Institute in Moscow actually produced wonderful literature in the second half of the 20th century. And also we have quite a lot of their work also done in what is today like the Central Asian stance. You have like a departments in which actually focus on Afghanistan study. In the kind of Eastern European, I think as far as, if I'm correct, I don't know how well now, but at least a few years ago, University of Warsaw was the only university actually established an independent department of Afghanistan studies. Took it out of the Iranian studies. It established like a direct connections with Kabul University, and it kind of like I went like many years ago. I once visited Warsaw, so there was like in a small department, but I think a vibrant and a rich one. So I think in an Anglo-American work, we don't know exactly where Afghanistan is still falls. I think now we are kind of between South Asia and Middle East. Or as Anil John said, maybe like Central Asia. But I think in the other tradition, like in a more Soviet, post-Soviet tradition, there is an independent Afghanistan studies, and there is a huge amount of interesting literature to look at it. But mostly in relationship either with the Muslim world in general or with Central Asia. That's what I know.
All right, so I learned a new term, peripheralizing Afghanistan. That's okay. So I guess my question stems from that word. How, particularly in Anglo-American literature about Afghanistan, because as Dr. Omar Sharifi suggested, it's a little bit different on the Soviet bloc at least. So how Afghan and international scholars of Afghanistan deperipheralize Afghanistan, what we should do or what we can do to deperipheralize Afghanistan in terms of bringing Afghanistan back to the center of attention in terms of the literature, scholarship, but also make it a little bit marketable. As you suggested, Dr. Benjamin, it's difficult for someone to say, like, I'm a scholar of Afghanistan, and then get a lot of opportunities in the United States or even in Europe.
I'll take a shot at that. If I can actually start off by giving a shout out to Dr. Sharifi's comment about the Rushphone world. St. Petersburg State has an incredible, for instance, Pashto language program still, and my colleague Mikhail Pelevin does wonderful work on that. It's interesting to read because it's just out of a totally different tradition intellectually than that which we're trained in the Western Academy. There's a lot of focus on a kind of Max Mueller linguistics over there, which we've just lost as a tradition. But that's another thing. How do we de-exceptionalize Afghanistan? I mean, the hard thing is because the ignorance level is so consciously and purposely high about Afghanistan, it's confusing to people, right? Anytime, at least I teach, and I'm sure this has got to be true for all of us, anytime we teach for Afghanistan, students do what students always do, and they try to compare Afghanistan with what they already know. And it's just so foreign to them, and it gets confusing. You talk about tribes, but then you say, well, we need to be very careful about talking about tribes in a tribal society because it's much more complicated, right? And so it's just a high bar, both intellectually, there's so many elements and disciplines you have to draw in to really give people a more nuanced understanding of this space. So conceptually, it's a difficult approach. And then factually, people just get very confused because they're like, I don't understand, all these Pashtun groupings and what's the difference between Hazaras and Imaks and et cetera, because this is so new to them. They may have run into, for instance, Iranians in the Persianate world or Indians before, but Afghans different. I see Dr. Dalitzai's hand up, so I'll just make one last comment because I don't want to monopolize time. But I would actually go back to the idea then of de-exceptionalizing Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan is in this kind of eddy because it's considered uniquely problematic and exceptional. It's this kind of hole where problems disappear. And actually, if we step back in the frame, there's a lot of places similarly situated to Afghanistan. That is not to erase the individuality of their history and their politics, but it is to say, yes, there's problems and issues in Afghanistan that are based in the locality, based in what's going on there, but there's also systemic reasons that carry across time and space that others share. And so Afghanistan is one of a number of similarly situated locales.
Yes, I apologize, Dr. Hopkins. I didn't mean to cut short your comments, but I only wanted to add to it, right? And I appreciated your reflection on and difficulties with teaching on Afghanistan and just how, it's a, I'll stop right there, but only to say that, I'm currently writing a paper, and it's a very difficult paper to write, but I think it must be written. Now, whether it's going to be published is a whole different thing. But I only want to extend that comment to say it's not only students, right? It's also professors. It's also other scholars. It's also, right? So granted, students are in the classroom and doing what students do, asking questions. When I look at my trajectory as a scholar and the kinds of comments and kinds of revisions I'm asked to do on journal articles, it is stunning, right? So I'm currently trying to write an article that literally breaks that down and says, what was at stake when they asked me to do this? What was at stake when they asked me to make this change? Right? And what does that say about where anthropology as a discipline is and has been and is going or not going? And what does it say about academia in general outside of the field of anthropology, right? So when I look at what fellow scholars have asked me to do, non-Afghan scholars, but not only and when I say non-Afghan scholars, I mean non-scholars of Afghanistan, as well as scholars of Afghanistan, it is stunning. Right. And when I look over 20 years and the kinds of things I've been asked to take out, it says quite a lot about academia in general and the discipline of anthropology. So I just wanted to add that to say simply, it's and that's why I in my opening comments, I said I'm now occupying the position of refusal. I just refuse to narrate certain things that they think are important to be able to, connect with an audience or whatever their aspirations are, right? So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
All right, welcome, Dr. Michael Berry. We are in the middle of Q&A, but it would be better if you get like 5 to 10 minutes to have an open remark about the imagining and reimagining Afghanistan. Hopefully we will have a few minutes to ask a few more questions, possibly from participants. And I have a few questions myself as well, but if, the panelists can have their own questions as well. So.
Well, to begin with, and I'm sorry I was only able to enter so late, so I didn't hear some of the preceding remarks. Reimagining Afghanistan is necessary because Afghanistan, as we knew it, is dying. And when a country is in the throes of death, it demands reimagining or succumbing. The closest parallel I can think of is Turkey which between 1917 and 1923 seemed about to disappear from the face of the earth. General Mustafa Kemal seized power and initiated a series of revolutionary changes, demanding no less than a complete refurbishing of Turkish mentalities in order to save Turkey practically from itself, a recognition that Turkey would not be able to resume its independent existence without, and I will most dwell on this aspect, without completely jettisoning the traditional role assigned to women. The Kemalist revolution recognized that the new Turkey had to grant the vote to women, which Turkish women even received before Swiss and French women, it so happens. Obviously, the canceling of the veil and various aspects of the Sharia code, complete emancipation for half the population of the country. We all know that current perceptions of Afghanistan outside Afghanistan, insofar as those perceptions still exist, are only concerned with the status of women in Afghanistan. That is simply a fact. Every other argument regarding Afghan politics, Afghan sociology, Afghan approaches to religion, every one of those questions, ethnic balance, social justice, relations towards Iran, or towards Pakistan, or towards Saudi Arabia, or towards Russia, or towards China, every one of those questions is now regarded as secondary. The treatment of women in Afghanistan has become the central test. Any Afghan moral figure, religious leader, political operative who will undertake to support absolute equality for women and men will be assured of international public opinion's support. Any Afghan political operative, humanitarian volunteer, religious leader who fails to address the central question of absolute equality for men and women will simply not be listened to by the international community. That is simply a hard fact. Now, recently I was able to address the Afghanistan Institute for Strategic Studies in London, and was brought to my attention an interview with Mullah Yaqub, the Minister of Defense of the Taliban government, regime or entity or whatever you want to call it, with Tolo News a year ago already, in early summer of 2023. And Mullah Yaqub said, we reject foreign interference because we defend Afghan tradition and we defend Islam. Well, that's the crux of the matter, because the answer to Mullah Yaqub is, number one, you say that you defend Afghan tradition, you are defining your Afghan tradition, but as a non-Afghan, I note that 101 years ago, the Afghan Constitution of 1923 affirmed the right of every woman, as of every man in Afghanistan, to enjoy access to education. 101 years ago, Afghanistan was a completely independent and sovereign state. 101 years ago, the Afghan Constitution of 1923 was drafted by Afghan jurists and implemented, insofar as it could, by an independent Afghan government, which means that I am entitled, from outside the frontiers of Afghanistan, to prefer an Afghan tradition which is more than 100 years old and which is authentically Afghan and truly was the expression of what many people in Afghanistan a century ago wanted. I can prefer that Afghan tradition, which accords with international human rights, to the Afghan tradition that is interpreted by Mullah Yaqub and goes counter to international human rights. So that's a very first and very important point. Further, regarding this first aspect, Mullah Yaqub and his government should know that they are defying the validity of the International Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations in 1948. If Mullah Yaqub's interpretation is correct, that means that not only Afghan women, but American women, European women, Indian women, Chinese and Japanese women, women in Nigeria, women in South Africa must be denied their fundamental rights. So Mullah Yaqub should not be surprised if there is some foreign objection. But Mullah Yaqub goes even farther, and this is a very dangerous step. He invokes Islam. Nobody from the outside forced Mullah Yaqub to say, we defend Islamic law, we defend Islam. Mullah Yaqub and his government choose to say that. And when they say that, they are talking about something which is not Afghan, because Islam is not an Afghan religion. Islam is a universal religion addressed to all humanity as a purported valid affirmation of the dialogue between the creator and the human soul everywhere. So it's not Afghan. It's also Pakistani or Egyptian or Turkish or indeed Canadian or Californian or wherever Muslims happen to live. Now, it so happens that if Mullah Yaqub and the Taliban government proclaim that they are defending Islam, then automatically they invite, indeed provoke, international interference, because Islam is an international religion. Now, we see that today, no Islamic polity represented in the United Nations denies education to women. Not one. This would seem to indicate that Mullah Yaqub and his government believe that only their interpretation of Islam is correct, and the interpretation of Islam in Turkey or Indonesia or Egypt or Morocco or anywhere else is incorrect. Well, when making such a claim, that is a foreign interference on the part of the Taliban government against just about, I think, 1/3 of the entire human family. So of course the entire human family reacts, rejects, condemns the appalling state of affairs in Afghanistan today. So I'll conclude now by returning to this idea of tradition. Everybody has traditions, and some of them are horrible. And very often in the course of a national existence, it becomes necessary to get rid of a tradition. As an American, and I know that every American listening will recognize our terrible tradition of slavery. We were enslavers, and many religious professionals defended slavery on Christian grounds. We're saving their souls. These poor people we're bringing from Africa, we're baptizing them. In the name of Christianity, ultimately, many people in the United States denounced slavery, and after a terrible war and many years of dealing with the sequels of that war, slavery and its terrible legacy was abolished. It was our tradition, but we abolished it. We abolished it in order to save the United States from the United States itself and be a better country. Are you saying, perhaps, that what the Taliban are doing to Afghan women is slavery? That is exactly what I'm saying. I would ask the international community, please stop using the words segregation and apartheid. Those were hypocritical legal formulas defined in the American case by the Supreme Court in 1896 as separate but equal. Well, it wasn't really equal, but that's what it pretended to be. And that is what the apartheid government in South Africa until 1992 affirmed that apartheid was separate but equal. That is not the case with Afghan women. Afghan women can be bought and sold by the people entitled to buy or sell them. Afghan women can be subjected to physical punishment and death for transgressing what will be considered to be the rights of those who are in possession of them. Free labor, pain of physical punishment, pain of death, those are definitions of slavery. I know the Afghan expression nangunamus, the name of honor. My call to all Afghans is to wear the badge of nangunamus as of human freedom for our sisters, our mothers, our wives, and our daughters. That male pride should lie in defense of women's rights. And Afghans who will engage in this long, arduous, bitter struggle will be rewarded by world recognition, world support. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael Berry. And just to connect to what Michael Berry suggested, I guess one question I have, and participants, please feel free to ask your questions. You can post your questions on the message on the Q&A box. I guess the question I have is, like, mostly the assumption is that colonialism is gone. In particular, the colonialist literature is like fading away. But with the return of the Taliban, we have, at least I have noticed or experienced, I would say, the new emergence of a new kind of Orientalism, again, you know, into the discourse, and And the suggestion that Afghanistan is a divided state, it cannot be put together, as Joe Biden suggested in one of his remarks. And you can look at the op-eds that's and the research papers that's being produced by different think tanks and scholars, suggesting in some ways, in one way or another, that the Taliban basically either represent the Afghan tradition or it's the only option for the Afghans, and basically misrepresenting Afghanistan once again. So I guess my question is it what you're experiencing as well, or it's just mine?
If you're asking me, I have been very unhappy with general American attitudes towards Afghanistan. Attitudes of disdain, scorn, contempt, disguised as cultural relativism, as you point out, which led to a decision in 2021 that, as a Democrat, as very opposed to Trump, as somebody who's certainly going to vote for our new Democratic candidate, of course, and I've said all that. Be that as it may, the decision taken in 2021 resembles one most appalling experience in American history. You're referring to colonialism. This sort of touches on it. The decision taken by President Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, 12 years after the end of the Civil War, under pressure from the conservatives in Congress, to withdraw all federal troops from all the former Confederate states, where those troops had been ensuring the security, the safety of Black emancipation. Once those troops were withdrawn in 1877, the southern states reestablished extreme racial segregation and indeed a form of slavery. I noticed a panelist was raising a question. Slavery was reintroduced in the disguised form of vast prison populations, young, healthy Black men sentenced for the most frivolous reasons and condemned to hard labor, which the prison system in the South farmed out to agricultural or business enterprises, free labor, slave labor, known as the chain gangs. And this horrendous system of slavery under another name endured really until 1964. And all this because in the perception of President Rutherford B. Hayes, a rather decent man by his own lights in 1877, Black rights didn't matter enough. There were other priorities. Afghanistan and the rights of Afghan women, as we can see from all the arguments bandied about, in 2021 didn't matter enough. Strategic arguments, we have to contain China. Economic arguments, they were wasting money, pouring it down a hole. All these arguments were made, but they boiled down to that dreadful argument, which doesn't even dare to confess what it is really saying. Afghan women don't matter enough, just as in 1877, Black Americans didn't matter enough.
Other panelists, esteemed panelists, you would like to jump in, or I should ask another question?
I could actually take a quick swing at that, Bashir. And I just make three quick points, actually building off something Omer said earlier, which is about how historically Afghanistan has not suffered from a secessionist movement. And I think you do see the valence of those colonial troops. If you read the president's speeches at the time of withdrawal in August of 2021, they're quite interesting because there's a lot going on in them, but there is the repetition of a number of colonial tropes that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires, that Afghanistan has never, ever, ever gotten along, that it's a ribbon, factionalized tribal society that really resonates with this kind of colonial picture. Two other things I would add quickly that I think are germane to the present moment of the Taliban, and that I think are an open question, at least to my mind. And I'd be interested to hear my co-panelists' thoughts on this. To my mind, the real issue comes down to 1978 and the Saur Revolution, in the sense of, at the time, Afghanistan had an incomplete but functional kind of social contract that was very limited about what the state would do and what it wouldn't do. And, lightly put, it was that the state was this multi-ethnic core in the cities that really would claim sovereignty over the countryside, but would never really interfere because of capacity issues and just didn't have the ambition. You have the Soviet PDPA, or the Soviet-backed PDPA period, where the state becomes very intrusive in the countryside, and I think collapses that social compact, as it were, and really destroys it. And to my mind, the issue about the Civil War since 78, which is under discussed, is what are the stakes of that? Like, what is the social compact or the political compact of the Afghan polity to be? And I don't think that has been answered. I think what we see with the Taliban ascendance is a temporary answer, but I don't think them capable of actually fashioning some sort of stable consensus around what that will be. The other thing is the realities of political economy, which I think are very important to note, which is that from its inception, the modern Afghan state has always been a rentier state. It's always been dependent on foreign patronage. For a long time, that patronage was the British colonial subsidy. In the Cold War, it becomes aid between the US and Soviets. Then it becomes the Soviets paying, and then it becomes the Americans paying. And we can see now the Taliban very desperately, on the one hand, trying to get their hands on the frozen assets in the United States, but on the other hand, also trying to find an international patron that can backstop the Afghan political economy, because that is a hard reality any governing entity in Afghanistan, I think, has to deal with. But again, I just offer those thoughts and would be interested in my co-panelist take on this.
Can I answer that? I think the participant, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, sir?
Dr. Benjamin Hopkins.
Yes, Dr. Benjamin Hopkins. I think you used a very appropriate word to describe Afghanistan situation going back to 1978, and I would almost go all the way back to 1924. Afghanistan has been in a state of latent or explosive civil war between various ideological factions. And to a certain extent, the legacy of King Amanullah was taken to an extreme by the Afghan Marxist-Leninists, and the reaction against them took another extreme form, which today appears as the Taliban, or sometimes their variant and rivals, Daesh. So we are dealing with a civil war, and the United States is kind of an exception. In most civil wars, the hatred between factions is so intense that the factions will call on foreign intervention against their own compatriots because they will prefer the foreigners to their own compatriots. And we've seen that throughout many 20th century civil wars. The Spanish Civil War, the Republicans were assisted by Russia, Soviet Russia, and the nationalists were assisted by the Italians and Germans. The French Civil War, in fact, during the German occupation, saw one group of French who welcomed German intervention and another group of French who called upon the British and the Americans. So I'm using these extreme examples just to point out in a non-colonialist way that very old European countries can go through traumas like this. And certainly the Afghan case shows how the extreme violence of what is a civil war has invited foreign interference. That doesn't mean that the various foreigners weren't also pushing their own perceived strategic advantages. Of course, Soviet, American, Pakistani, Iranian, what have you. Be that as it may, Afghanistan is in a state of civil war. I would say the civil war started with the first Eastern tribal uprising against Amanullah in 1924, and it has widened ever since. And so I don't know if colonial is an apt term. I would suggest that where Afghanistan escaped the usual colonial situation is because none of the modern great powers, British, Soviet, Russian, or American, were particularly interested in Afghanistan in any positive sense, meaning a country in which to invest in order to exploit minerals and other primary materials. The perception on the part of the British and the Soviet Russians and the Americans regarding Afghanistan has usually been very negative. The British held India. Afghanistan was a strategic area to be denied to the Russians. So the British attitude towards Afghanistan was essentially negative. The Soviet attitude towards Afghanistan was get out of the way, we're on our way to the headwaters of the Persian Gulf. Fundamentally negative. The American attitude sort of picks up from the British with an ideological sting added to it. Afghanistan must be denied to any group which we consider intolerable to American security. The Soviets in the 1980s, because too close to the Gulf, and Islamic terror in the first decades of the 21st century. But it's a negative attitude. And that is why only those Afghan leaders who understood exactly the way the great powers thought were able to negotiate this negative attitude to the advantage of the Afghan state. The emirs Dost Muhammad and Abdur Rahman in the 19th century understood exactly what the British wanted and what the Russians wanted. So they were able to find an accommodation. I would argue that the 20th century and 21st century Afghan leaders have largely failed correctly to analyze the goals of foreign powers surrounding Afghanistan. And given that Afghanistan remains a negative, in the United States in 2021, the overwhelmingly powerful perception was we have no interest in Afghanistan. Therefore, we withdraw. Our negative interest was denying Afghanistan to the Taliban and to Al-Qaeda. But if the Taliban now tell us that they will not tolerate further terrorist attacks from Afghan soil, they removed the main American incentive, which was a negative one. Deny the space to what is intolerable. But if it becomes tolerable to us, It doesn't matter what happens inside the Afghan space. And that was, in very many ways, the British attitude when they withdrew in 1842 and in 1880 and in 1919. Whatever happens inside, fine, as long as it does not represent an intolerable threat to us. We'll withdraw. Doesn't matter. Our interest is only negative. Now comes the burden of proof for Afghans to cry out to the world. There is a positive. Universal human rights is a positive. And that is the message which has to ring very loud and clear.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar Sharifi. We're a little 12 minutes over the time, but you wanted to say
Can I
something?
stop? I don't need
Go ahead.
to. I mean, if but just maybe 1-2 minutes, so perhaps to answer Dr. Hopkins' comments. Since I think 2004-3, I mean, there is a lot of discussions on like decolonizing Afghanistan studies and everything outside, but actually we see kind of a similar movement happening inside. Because after 25 years since like the communists and then the Mujahideen Taliban period, in which almost there was nothing has been done in a way, there was like the space at post 2001 was kind of allowed. There is a kind of emergence of a movement to kind of completely reimagine or actually reevaluate the whole understanding of history, what's religion, how we have to imagine ourselves, what are the relationships, who we are and stuff. So I think a lot of in the last couple of years, especially in the second decade of this century, post 2013, when this generation of the Afghans who actually tried to study, went to study abroad in the early 2000s, kind of have the ability to start to write. We've seen a lot of things produced in Farsi, a lot of things produced in Pashto, but also some works are coming in English. But inside in the local languages, I've seen that. And if we just kind of look once to, for instance, the Amiri publishers, like if you the list of the works that they're published by local Afghans and trying to figure out both in the universities or those who return from Iran or Pakistan, there's a huge amount of work actually done to kind of think in which this is space, because specifically I see that in the context of how the international kind of like what Biden says, the Afghans like that, what they are and stuff. It's true that I mean, maybe in 2000s, there was not much work done, but in the last 20 years, huge amount in which we actually trying to discuss. And I think for those of us actually who want to kind of look at Afghanistan and trying to understand it's like what it is today, looking at the like indigenous sources, both in Farsi and Pashto, and there's a huge amount of translation too, I think would be a wonderful way to move ahead. But there is a discourse happening right now within the Afghan academia and intellectuals in general to kind of reevaluate ourselves. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can end the session with 1 minute probably for each of the panelists. If you can conclude your basically present a concluding remark, maybe give us some advice as when we are looking at the articles, books, or the literature in general, what are some red flags that we should look at when we are talking about the issue of, for example, Orientalist approach towards Afghanistan or the colonialist vision of Afghanistan? Or just a concluding remark. We can start with Dr. Benjamin.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mubashir. I would just end where I began, which is to thank you for organizing this panel, as well as thanking my fellow panelists. I've learned a lot from them over the years in their writing and through discussions, and look forward to learning about them. I'd say two things. One, an excitement, actually building on Dr. Sharifi's comment about how active the thought and intellectual community, especially the Afghan intellectual community, is right now, that it is a dark moment for Afghanistan itself, but I think there are some bright spots in that. And then secondly, just, I think right now, unfortunately, our duty is to remember, because everybody else is trying to forget. So that.
Dr. Omar Sharifi.
Well, thank you again for inviting us. I think we are, and sometimes we have an expression in Farsi that Ganj Dawairan as a treasure sometimes ruins. Afghanistan seem very destroyed and stuff today, forgotten and almost dying. But I have a feeling looking at the work that's going on inside, the kind of a reimagining Afghanistan by both because international scholars and the indigenous. I think looking at that in a way probably, well, not probably, but I'm pretty sure that actually will prevent this process of decay and dying that Dr. Berry mentioned. And we keep, and I have a lot of hope for our new generation of scholars. And I've seen a lot of them in these different conferences, colloquiums we had in different universities. I think a new generation, a new discourse on Afghanistan is emerging, and that it will be probably very different from what we have ever experienced in the pre-war period. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Michael Berry.
Yes, please. My call is to transcend Afghan specialist studies. Afghan specialist studies, of course, gives us authority to say certain things, but Afghanistan as an object of study should not, must not be an end in itself. I believe the future of Afghan national rebirth lies in the universal and not in the particular. Afghans establishing through intellectuals like Dr. Omar Sharifi and you, Dr. Mubasher, lies in connecting with the great movements for the defense of human rights all over the world, so that the world sees Afghan liberation as human liberation. And that is a support which will never go away once you have earned it. So that's my plea. Please go from the particular to the universal, because Afghanistan's very existence is at stake.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we do not have Dr. Anila Dawladzai with us. She had to leave because she had a class after this. But it was an honor to be amongst you guys and to moderate the panel. Thank you very much for accepting to join the panel and being part of the panel and giving us a lot of thoughts and recommendations and suggestions. And one of our participants asked if we have a recording of this event that we can share with them, because some of them have participated late. I'd say yes. The good news is yes, we will post it on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. So it's going to be available to all audience of the channel, and we will certainly share it on our social media as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin Hopkins, Dr. Michael Berry, and Dr. Omar Sharifi, and Dr. Anila Dawladzai, who is no longer with us. Thank you very much, Mr. Nazif, for doing the technical stuff for the panel, as well as to Professor Tawab Danesh, who is the director of Afghanistan Reimagining Forum. And this topic, this panel, was very timely and very suitable for this forum, because the forum was about reimagining Afghanistan. So if anyone had any question about, what did we mean by reimagining Afghanistan forum, this is what we meant. So thank you so much. I appreciate you all. Bye-bye.
خدا نگهدار. با امان خدا.